Breaking. Donald Trump just banned Canada on live television. Not a tariff, not a trade restriction, not a carefully worded policy directive issued through official channels with legal framework attached. A ban announced live on camera in front of the American people and the watching world with the casual, unambiguous finality of a man who has decided that the time for diplomatic language has passed entirely. And Mark Carney responded in three words that broke every news channel simultaneously. Three words that crashed social media platforms within minutes of being spoken. Three words that traveled from Ottawa to every capital on earth faster than any press release, any diplomatic cable, any official statement has ever traveled in the history of the bilateral relationship. Three words that will be quoted in classrooms and in history books and in the diplomatic training programs of nations that study this period for decades as the moment that defined not just a prime minister but a country. Three words, and the world has not stopped talking about them since. To understand the ban, to understand what Trump announced on live television and why he announced it in the way he announced it, you have to understand the week that preceded it. It had been the worst week of the confrontation for Washington. The UN General Assembly speech, 193 nations standing, the American delegation walking out, the 8-hour silence before a State Department statement that contradicted itself and collapsed under its own weight. The international media coverage that had shifted permanently, visibly, irreversibly from covering Canada as a nation under pressure to covering Canada as the nation leading the world's most important conversation about the future of international order. The procurement cancellations, 3 million American jobs touched, $14 billion gone overnight. The Senate Finance Committee hearing, the Republican senators counting the cost in their own districts, the 3 deals in a week, the EU partnership, the India framework, the African Union signing, 3 continents without American participation. Each one in isolation was a manageable political problem for an administration with the communications infrastructure and the domestic political capital to absorb it. Together, accumulated in the space of weeks, they had produced something that Washington's political operatives were describing in private as a credibility crisis, not with Canadian voters, with American ones. Because the American public had been told from the beginning of the confrontation that Canada would fold, that the pressure would work, that the satellite would behave like a satellite and the neighbor would accept its place and the middle power would remember its dependence and come to the table on American terms. None of that had happened. Canada had not folded. The pressure had not worked. The satellite had launched its own orbit, and the middle power had stood at the United Nations and received a standing ovation from 193 nations while the American delegation sat in silence. The gap between what had been promised and what had occurred was visible to the American public, to American media, to the congressional members whose constituents were feeling the consequences of a trade war that had been sold as a quick win. Trump had a problem, and Trump's solution to political problems has always been the same: escalation. A move so dramatic, so attention-commanding, so completely beyond the expectations of the political environment that it resets the narrative and forces the world to react to him rather than to the accumulating evidence of what has gone wrong. He chose live television. He was in the middle of a White House media availability, a format he has always been most comfortable with. The unscripted, direct engagement with cameras that allows him to drive the news cycle through the unpredictability of what he might say next. A reporter asked about Canada, about the UN speech, about the standing ovation, about the 3 deals, about the Senate Finance Committee hearing, about the polls showing that a majority of Americans in border states had unfavorable views of the administration's handling of the Canada confrontation. Trump looked at the camera and said it. Canada is banned. We're done with Canada. Banned. No more access. No more deals. No more of this back and forth. Banned. Banned, said 4 times with a repetitive emphasis that signals not a considered policy announcement, but an emotional declaration. The kind of statement that emerges not from a strategy session, but from a man who has heard one question too many about a situation that is not going the way he said it would go. The word detonated. In financial markets, which processed the word banned applied to the largest bilateral trading relationship on Earth, with the particular alarm of systems designed to detect systemic risk and found one. In legal circles, where the word banned applied to a sovereign allied nation with no specific legal framework, no executive order, no legislative authority, and no defined mechanism of implementation, raised questions that no one in Washington's legal apparatus had apparently considered before the word was said. In diplomatic circles where BAND applied to a G7 ally, a NATO partner, a Five Eyes intelligence sharing nation, and a co-signatory of NORAD, produced a reaction that ranged from alarm in allied capitals to something approaching disbelief. In the Canadian business community, which had been navigating the confrontation with the careful contingency planning of organizations that understood the risks but had not modeled this particular scenario, and in Ottawa, where the clip of Trump saying "banned" arrived on every phone in the Prime Minister's office within seconds of being broadcast, Carney was in a meeting. The meeting stopped. He watched the clip once, looked at the people in the room with him, and said something to his communications director that sources describe as the calmest instruction delivered in the most extraordinary circumstances of his entire premiership. "I'll respond in the House." In the House. Not at a podium in the foyer of the Langevin block, not in a national address from the PMO, not through a written statement distributed to the press gallery. In the House of Commons, the institution, the chamber, the place where Canadian democracy has conducted its business for generations, the room that represents more than any other physical space in the country what Canada actually is. He walked into the House of Commons. Every member was already there. News of Trump's live television announcement had reached every parliamentary office before Carney's car had cleared the driveway. The chamber had filled with a speed and a completeness that the House administration would later describe as unprecedented for a non-scheduled sitting. They were all there. Every Liberal, every Conservative, every NDP member, every Bloc member, every Independent, all of them watching, waiting. Carney walked to his place, stood at the dispatch box, looked at the chamber, and said 3 words. "Canada is open." The chamber erupted. Not in the partisan, orchestrated way that staged political moments produce, but in the spontaneous, simultaneous, involuntary way that happens when something true is said at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, to exactly the right audience. Every member was on their feet before the echo of the 3rd word had settled. The speaker, whose role requires the particular neutrality of someone who presides over a chamber rather than participating in it, was observed by multiple journalists present to be standing. Outside the House of Commons, the clip, 3 words, 6 seconds, the entirety of what needed to be said, was on every platform before Carney had sat back down. Canada is open. The antithesis, the direct, immediate, 3-word rebuttal to a 4-word declaration. Not an argument, not a counter policy, not a diplomatic protest or a legal filing or a trade measure or an alliance announcement, a statement of identity. Canada is open. Not open for business in the transactional sense of a government advertising its investment climate. Open in the deeper sense, the value sense, the sense that a country built by immigrants, governed by the rule of law, committed to the principles of sovereign equality and rules-based international cooperation, and currently standing as the nation that 193 others had just stood for, does not close, cannot close, will not close, because closing is not what Canada is. The reaction was instantaneous, global, and unlike anything in the history of Canadian political communication. The clip of Carney's 3 words was shared more times in the first hour than any Canadian political content had ever been shared in any time frame. Not in Canada, in the world. In the United Kingdom, where the clip was trending within 20 minutes. In France, where the 3 words were translated and shared with commentary describing them as the most elegant political response in living memory. In Germany, Australia, Japan, India, South Africa, Brazil, in every country that had been watching the confrontation and that had in the previous week watched 193 of their members stand for Canada at the United Nations. They shared it millions of times with the particular energy of people who recognized in 3 words something they had been hoping someone would say. The hashtag Canada is open trended globally within 30 minutes. Not just trending, the #1 trend on every major platform in 17 languages simultaneously. American social media was divided in the way American social media always is. But among the American voices engaging with the clip, a pattern emerged that the administration's political analysts found deeply uncomfortable. Ordinary Americans, not political commentators, not partisan advocates, not the engaged political class, but the ordinary Americans whose opinion shapes election outcomes, were sharing Carney's 3 words alongside Trump's 4 with a comparison that did not favor the American president. The contrast was not manufactured. It was natural, Organic, the product of two statements made in the same news cycle that revealed through their proximity something about the men who made them and the countries they represented. One man said, banned 4 times loudly on live television. One man said 3 words quietly in Parliament once. The world decided which statement it preferred. American business associations issued emergency statements within hours of Trump's ban announcement. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, not typically an institution that breaks with Republican administrations on matters of foreign economic policy, released a statement describing the ban declaration as deeply concerning for American businesses and American workers whose livelihoods depend on the Canada-U.S. economic relationship. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce publicly describing a presidential declaration as deeply concerning. The legal community's response was equally pointed. Constitutional scholars and international trade lawyers appeared on every major American broadcast, trying to explain what a ban on Canada would actually mean in legal terms, and consistently arriving at the same answer. Nobody knows because the word was said without a legal framework, without an executive order, without a defined mechanism. The ban as declared did not legally exist. It was a word said on television by a man who was angry. But words said on television by American presidents are not nothing. They move markets. They affect behavior. They create facts on the ground that outlast the specific legal ambiguity of their declaration. In this word, banned was creating facts on the ground with extraordinary speed. Canadian tourists who had been considering American trips were not considering them anymore. Canadian businesses that had been in preliminary discussions with American partners were pausing those discussions pending clarity. Canadian students enrolled at American universities were calling their Canadian consulates. Canadian citizens with green cards were calling immigration lawyers. The human dimension of the word was landing everywhere simultaneously on real people, making real decisions about their lives based on a word that had no legal definition, but enormous practical weight. Carney had answered it with 3 words that gave those people something to hold on to. Canada is open for the tourists redirecting their spending to Canadian destinations. Canada is open for the businesses pausing their American discussions. Canada is open for the students wondering about their futures. Canada is open for the Canadians in America wondering about their status. Canada is open for every allied nation watching the confrontation and asking whether the principles of sovereign equality and open international engagement had a future in a world where the most powerful nation was issuing bans on its neighbors on live television. Canada is open. The G7 responded with a speed and a unity that the confrontation had not previously produced. All 6 non-American G7 members issued a joint statement within hours of Trump's ban declaration. The statement was carefully worded in the way G7 communications always are, but its core message was clear and it had a specific address. The G7 members reaffirmed their commitment to the principles of open trade, sovereign equality, and rules-based international cooperation. They expressed their full solidarity with Canada, and they called on all parties to the current bilateral confrontation to return to the frameworks of international law and agreed bilateral mechanisms. All parties called on to return to frameworks. 6 of the world's 7 largest economies jointly, publicly calling Washington back to the rules. Inside the PMO that evening, sources described the atmosphere as the particular quality of focused calm that has characterized every moment of this confrontation when Canada has made its most significant moves. Not triumph, not relief, the steady determination of people who understand that they are not at the end of something, they are in the middle of it. The ban will be legally challenged. The 3 words will be cited. The G7 statement will be filed. The markets will settle or not settle. The American lawyers will clarify or not clarify what banned actually means in the legal architecture of the bilateral relationship. All of that is the work of tomorrow and the day after and the weeks and months ahead. But tonight, one man said banned 4 times on live television. And one man responded with 3 words in Parliament, and the world chose the 3 words. Canada is open. Not as a slogan, not as a campaign line, not as the output of a communication strategy developed in a war room by political operatives optimizing for engagement metrics, as a statement of what Canada is and what Canada will remain. Regardless of what any foreign government declares on live television, regardless of any ban, Canada is open. 3 words, the most powerful 3 words spoken by any leader anywhere in the world this year, and every news channel on earth is still talking about them. For Canada politics, stay with us, Canada.